It's so good to see you and so good to be here virtually in Philadelphia. And thank you, Larry. And Martine, congratulations on your new book. I was just thinking the first time I remember we read together was 1992 in Battery Park in New York when my book, My Father's Geography, came out. I remember that. I remember us standing at the refreshment table talking together. But it's good to be here. And I want to start off with something that Eleanor referenced, which is my actual departure from the factory. I had my first book published, and I've been watching this program on HBO, which is really good. It's called Black Art in the Absence of Light. And the launching, so to speak, of that program is David Driscoll, and talking about the exhibit he did of Black art in 1976. And it just so happens that his artwork is on the cover of my very first book, and it's called Water Song. And you can see there's a woodcut on the side. That's David Driscoll's work. And he let me into his studio at the University of Maryland, College Park, and said that I could just pick any images that I wanted. And my editor, Charles Rowell, and I settled on the woodcut, all right? And the very first poem in the book is what I like to read because I think it touches on some of the things I'll be reading about today. It's entitled Borders. I have seen lines on a paper turn 4-lane highways to roads, snaking through clusters of pine, raise foot-high grass and medians, pull the tongues of people to a draw, tighten the air and fill it with honey. Put the hands of women on their hips, stand them in peanut fields with straw hats, slow the paces of men to a crawl, and sit them on the gas pumps of one-room stores, scratch belligerence in the eyes of whites. I have gone south in summer nights, watching the sun rise haughty and oppressive. I have felt God tinker with man's differences, moving through our quartered spaces, making strangers of the same flesh and blood. And in keeping with art now, it's spirit boxing the phoenixes. And it was quite a treat that day to be able to read with poets from mainland China that I've gotten to know over the years. And we were gathered there to celebrate Xu Bing's Flying Phoenixes. And so the title is Xu Bing's Flying Phoenixes in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. I am 64, and millions of lives are buttons on the coats of magnificent birds that arise from lost memories of building China from under waves of assaults. In Beijing, 10 years earlier, I wait with poets and students to walk and speak, wandering through this language of aging with Shurger, poet once homeless, now sung as mythic ancestor of generations in the word. These buttons on birds of metal rising from ashes are lives of men and women who went into jobs, who never came home, who came home and died for pipe dreams, or dreams of a country, the dust bowl lifting up from starving families in the grapes of wrath, the shuffling armies of Black sharecroppers, leaving the South for the North's harsh ways, under waves of assaults. In Kunming, I sit in a Muslim restaurant with a poet who gave me the Quran in Chinese, while around me, folks celebrate the end of a day of work, sitting in a park, listening to the erhu, its eloquent moaning where Yu Jin sings about working in a metal factory, while Wang Xiaoni worked on a farm, later to be the first woman to write after re-education. What do we know when we die, when our poetry writes history? I am 19, 3 Negro classics for lunch, a worker poet in an America where our soldiers kill our students. We are pilgrims in our souls. John Henry sleeping in high grass. Mowers miles away, mud flies on top his hammer like they own it, his chest cresting and falling in shapes, shifting between sunlight and leaves, black steel his destiny. John is motion at rest, tides of moon and waves and still waters, suns igniting hearts of molten iron, a hardened conviction, rose petals in rain. Sleep is a dream, the real world a poundage, work a sentence for being his mama's son, the hammer in his crib, the supernatural, a drum song of woodpeckers, cowbells in the field, heaven, a home going back to a place before the bugle call to be born. When I was deciding to write this book, I was thinking that it would be, as my 15th collection, a return to water song. So this is actually water song all grown up, or more grown up than it was in 1985. Looking back on it at this point, I think about the question of what industrial culture has done to Earth and whether or not industrial culture can save us from what industrial culture has done, and how industrial culture is related to slavery, the method of production and managing people in factories is based on management science from the period of American slavery. So the Lay of Paradise, 1970. So I went into the steel mill right after the shootings at Kent State and Jackson State in Mississippi. The Lay of Paradise, 1970. 3-story overhead electric cranes clicking, tractors large enough to carry elephants rolling, mashing the wooden brick floor down, down, steel pins spinning so fast they have a silent hiss. Shears cutting shiny tin into thin plates at speeds fast enough to cut the bone away so cleanly a man has to remember to scream. The balers pulling scrap tin, arms, legs, heads onto the pin to make them small enough to be melted, sold as Cadillacs or prayed over in graves. The soles of safety shoes of men and women tapping metal-plated walkways to workstations. I sit and sew word onto word when the mill is down. I study the invocation and wait to see a poem come out from the skylight in the mesh of corrugated metal walls, a web of language looking like nothing but carrying everything that makes everything, the crucible of metaphor. I am a child in the art. The art is a child in me. In the world of industrial jobs in Baltimore at that time, 1970, you could literally walk from one job to another, but that's gone. As a matter of fact, you can't do that in too many places in this country right now, for sure. And I left the steel mill and went to Procter & Gamble, a soap manufacturer right there on the harbor near the downtown place they built for tourists. And I stayed there for 14 years. And I had a job at times of stacking product on the floor. And some of those boxes weighed 100 pounds. There were these giant boxes of ivory soap. And when I saw them coming around the conveyor belt, I steadied myself because they weighed half as much as I did. Spirit boxing. It is the tightness in the gut when the load is heavy enough to knock me over backward, turn me back on my heel until my ankle cracks and I holler out, Jesus, this Jesus of Joe Gans, setting up for the next punch while taking in one that just made his soul wobble. The grunt I make when the shift is young, my body a heavy meat on bones, conveyors not wired for compassion, trucks on deadlines, uncaring pressure of a nation waiting to be washed, made clean, me looking into the eye of something like death. And I look up throwing 50-pound boxes. Jesus, now John Henry, pounding visions of what work is. The wish for Black life to crumble, snap under all it is given. These three souls of spirit, hands like hammers, a hammer like the word made holy, word echoing a scripture from inside the wise mind that knows men cannot be makers, that in making we want to break each other, ache moving us to refuse to surrender to time in factories, catacombs, feeding on the spirit. There was a truck driver. I have a soft spot in my heart for truck drivers. And at Procter & Gamble, of those 14 years, I spent 10 in the warehouse because the production lines weren't very conducive to writing poetry. It wasn't safe to take your mind off of all that machinery. But once I got into the warehouse in 75, I think that's when I put together my first manuscript. And that became Water Song. Took 10 years to get it published, but in the warehouse, I could move around. I had a sweeper, I could ride on that. I stuck books behind my seat next to a sandwich and would hide in a corner of the warehouse. But the truck drivers in those 10 years were just very interesting people. And when the pandemic hit, they were the first people I thought of, because this country doesn't realize stuff doesn't come by magic when you press the button on a computer. It goes on a truck or an airplane or a train. A truck driver from West Virginia. He called himself Billy, although we knew he had another name. Him here telling us how he hated white people, him as white as the white people we knew, but crisscrossed over in his mind by the groove Appalachia makes up and down the back of this country. His blues were made on the backs of folk more blue than Black folk origins of the blues. Billy so loud he could make loud hide itself in white shame. Taking his breaks with us, waiting for his truck to be filled with what washed the dirty laundry of a country he believed did not believe in him. Tipsy drunk as he was on the days he announced to us he was a hillbilly, like a lone wolf howling, sitting on his back legs lost in the woods, afraid of what to feel in a space empty of whiteness, filled with strange cruelties. This the holy space of who can look down at us. His arm in a cast, Billy broke a thing harder than he was, the thing that tried to let him own a certain kind of dignity, the cab of his rig easing out of the truck yard, his baseball cap bouncing him back to the hills. And some of my family members are here on the reading in the Zoom boxes, and they probably know, they may not know that when I left Procter & Gamble, my father was very upset. He thought I was just throwing my life away. He said, "Boy, that's the best job you could ever have. Why are you going to walk away from that?" And so it took me about 5 years to get back to the salary and academia I had when I was left the warehouse. And my father was not impressed until I told him I had medical insurance, never mind the poetry. So, and I'd like to read one more from Spirit Boxing before I go on to a few things that are somewhat new, some very new. And the repack room. So I'm 69 years old. And if I had stayed in the factory, I would have been given a job in the warehouse in the repack room. And it's where guys like me with bad knees and arthritis and bad backs repack soap. When the box is busted, you got new boxes, and put the soap in, and you drank coffee, played crossword puzzles, and listened to the radio all day, and nobody bothered you, you know? You were put out to pasture. And still, and some of those guys left that job with close to $1 million in stock that they got through profit sharing. But sadly enough, some of them didn't live very long after they retired. Yeah. But they told me just before I left, for about 2 or 3 years, they said to me, walking to the repack room, walking side to side on bad knees, they said, you better get out of here before you end up like us, the repack room. A coffee pot, chairs for tired joints, the morning paper, our warehouse was a kinder place to men in their late years. Old timers who hobbled from leg to leg on sore knees that had climbed up onto forklifts for 40 years, had fallen, slipped, and fell on the cement floor when it took on ice in winter, and the galvanized walls made winter sharper when we forgot our thermals or forgot we were getting too old to be without them. This was the company's blind eye turned to men who could not still keep up with production lines and quotas for loading trucks, men who had fought in World War II and Korea, who had loaded shells on giant anti-aircraft guns on ships at sea, defending home and coming home to make what was a fortune to the poor and pennies to the rich. One sore knee to the other, one strained back to the other, one set of clogged and swollen arteries to another, trading pictures of their grandchildren, planning trips to Mexico, and the evening of a life of duty. And now in my evening, I think of duty, of who owns us and what gifts we give now that I am old enough for the repack room. The slow job of salvaging good bars of soap from busted boxes, the spirit of my old worker sitting in an office with books. So many was the day when I would sit in my office there at Simmons with that endowed chair and wonder, what am I doing here? You know. So I will read, I was just made professor emeritus. I'm very happy about that at Simmons. So that was really great. And I have some things here to read to close out with the last few minutes or so. And this is a manuscript that's sort of pulling itself together. I found myself writing about things specifically relating to racial violence and slavery off and on over the years. And I just wanted to read some of these things to you. This one is entitled My First Gun. I grew up in East Baltimore, and part of my neighborhood was used for the TV show The Wire. On the other side of Milton Avenue, over by Mumford, there was this block or so of abandoned buildings. Anyway, and then also a corner store I recognized. My first gun. Not even a week out of prison, he's sticking the thing in my face, 6-inch barrel, 22 or 38, ages I just might not make. Minding my business or minding his in our world, the top of the hill, high point of the valley, Milton Avenue, our grave. This is a world folk will name with cameras, the corner and later the wire, sad stories of children not yet born, our children, cherubs. A gun changes things, changes your mind, and not even a week out of prison, he's sticking the thing in my face and I count the chambers, 6 chambers, 6 the sum of 2 times sacred 3, 3 the number of parts of God or a liquor bottle, the cap, the head, the body, a shallow torso to break. A gun changes things, changes your black mind, makes you want one to talk back to the one pointing in your face, but dumb guns don't talk, they wait. When they speak in thunder, the loud tap on the body to demand that it open itself up, edges of black skin screaming the way angels cry. Blues and 454, the violence in Chicago. In movies about the end of our civilization, toys fill the broken spaces of cities, flipping over in streets where children are all hoodlums, big kids painting themselves in neon colors while the women laugh, following the men into a love of madness. Still shots show emptiness tearing the eyes of the last of us who grew to be old, the ones the hoodlums prop up in shadows, throwing garbage at us, taping open our eyes, forcing us to study the dead, in photos torn from books and burned down libraries. Chicago used to be Sundays at Gladys's Luncheonette, where church folk came and ate collard greens and chicken after the sermons that rolled out in Black churches, sparkling tapestries of words from preachers' mouths, prayer books, tongues from Tell Me, Alabama, or Walk On, Mississippi. Now light has left us, the sun blocked out by shreds of what history becomes when apathy shreds it, becoming a name the bad children give themselves as they laugh and threaten each other while we starve for the laughter we were used to before the end came. I met Lucille Clifton in the winter of 1974 to 75, just as I was working on the original manuscript of Water Song. And I was moving from the packing floors to the warehouse. And Lucille was such a good friend and mentor, although we never talked about mentoring. I just knew that I could pick up the phone and call Lucille and read a poem to her, and she would listen. And this is an elegy for her, an elegy for Lucille with an epigraph from her book Slave Ships that allot the phrase, "onto a heathen country." It's the old Shirley Highway, the road a woman inspired, flattened the curves, the way for farmers to go home. I turn to hear the way you reach deep in the crevice of a tale to let me know the secrets of how to get through. There is a fire in the hills, are we lost? In my father's last new car, the green Chevy he bought from Charlie Irish just as I was getting to know the price. Mill towns drop out of the lips of clouds, the way buffalo must have puffed at night, and I know the legend you are. There is a fire in the hills, are we lost? If a radio could catch the frequency of a magic woman with ears to heaven, it would sit still now between us. The words rise up from the way we lose time in the fold of by and by, the slipped anacrusis of gospels. There is a fire in the hills, are we lost? On June 17th, 2015, a young white man walked into Mother Emanuel AME Church and sat down, spent time with the people he later killed. What a Fellowship is the title of this from the hymn, What a Fellowship, What a Grace Divine, etc., for Mother Emanuel AME. In these clasped hands, we see the seeds of what has come to be, the tiny black faces of children chained into ships headed to sea, not an invitation to a better life, not a vote for the human, but the deadened greed, a wish against what life means to the living, a cruelty above the requirements of evil. Our ambition to live, to survive, to grow beyond chains now, our only hope in row after row of bloody pews. In these clasped hands, we see the business of selling human beings, white hands of banks, the black hands of enemies selling enemies to regal promenades in France and Belgium, to arrogant philosophies of enlightenment, a plodding Kant, a foolish Hume, murderers in the name of knowledge, architects of theft, a broad sweep to rape the world and grow fat, to assume, to consume, to accumulate, to kill. In these clasped hands, we see the endless heart, proud hands that bent heads down to save them, caring souls that made a new love from carnage, the wreckage of lives, piles of bones, crumbling to dust and mounds all around, forming breath from stench, forming the sweet Sunday dinner after church, after gathering the word of this new God with the promise of a redeemer, a hand with the power to end death's bondage. In these clasped hands, we hear the songs, the mourning, the celebration from worlds left in Africa, forgotten except in the pulse of what we remember of the drum, the stomp of holy dances, of invoking the Holy Spirit to visit, opening our prayer to wind, to fire, to the great wash of oceans, to mountains rising and falling in visions, to dominions over fish, fowl, beast, and Eden's contract. In these clasped hands, we hear Philadelphia, white crochet crowns on heads of our matrons waiting to receive communion, throats clearing for the next hymn, the ritual cheers to pastors stuck in old sermons, the occasional Baptist eruption in misty AME precision, the way we wind the stairs to building a life where the brick and mortar are the bone and soul of courage, of the get on up now somehow. In these clasped hands, we hold the hope of another day braided on strands of grief across what divides us, what makes us one. And I will read just one more poem and then turn it over to my friend Martin to celebrate his new book. And let me just say from that last poem, was that phrase, get on up. And it's a kind of, it's a phrase that's sort of written inside my spirit. And from what I grew up in Baltimore, which is to my understanding, my experience of Southern City, raised by Southerners. And if life got a little hard, you fell down, old folk would say, get on up now, get up, So that's how we get through. Get up. Don't just sit there or lie there. Get on up. And this last piece is Ephemera. It was published in The Nation a week ago, actually, February 20th. And well, it's one of my pandemic poems. I didn't write many pandemic poems. This might be the only one. Ephemera. Each morning I sit in silence. The time slides, changes in my heart, a moss-covered cavern where its fire wakes me to a camaraderie of light. My wife waking upstairs to walk to her window to pray, to gaze outward at the pasture where Wappinger people eyed white men making laws to own people and the land. Art rules this old house, its rough rafters set in earth as the colony became a state, and Poughkeepsie forgot its own wonder, a gathering of reeds on banks of a river Hudson believed would take him to China. His breath unnoticed these days by the hummingbirds that visit our door, sounds of their wings like my fingers tapping my mother's empty Tupperware bowl with cake batter, a thin film she let me lick only when I was good, to taste something I let leave as I sit waiting to be aware, woke as some say. I imagine the sun, its fire, its electricity, waiting for us when we have lived all we can live, hoped all we can hope, some of us snatched away by the virus, corona raft of a world disturbed. Surprised as we are by nature's decisions, we refuse to surrender, to let go of what kills us when we try to control all of what we cannot see. Our house is now inside me. It is me, I am it, my bowels and spine, its forgotten birth, my thinning skeleton, now its heavy rafters, my emptiness, its emptiness, my fullness, its fullness, or ideas of the breath, our two minds held still by the fastening of it all, hook and joint, sinew and bone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eleanor, for that introduction. Thank you so much, Aafa, for your powerful, unmistakable voice, the stories you tell. I featured Aafa's work most recently in my anthology entitled What Saves Us? Poems of Empathy and Outrage in the Age of Trump from Northwestern. Eleanor's poems are also in that book. Of course, I want to thank Larry Robin and the Moonstone Cultural Arts Center. I want to thank John Lavin for the first Moonstone podcast. And I want to especially thank my wife, Lauren, for everything, but especially for being present on every single page of this book. I am going to be reading from that book this afternoon, and I'll start off with the first poem in the book, which is called Jumping Off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. Now, 30 years ago, I was a tenant lawyer with Su Clínica Legal, a legal services program for low-income Spanish-speaking tenants in Chelsea, Massachusetts, right across the Mystic Tobin Bridge from Boston. And the clients came from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic. They also came from Central America, from El Salvador, from Guatemala. In other words, the same people crossing the southern border today, fleeing the same countries left in ruins by Reagan's wars. The second half of this poem also refers to the notorious Chuck Stewart murder case in Boston. So we begin here with Jumping Off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. I close my eyes and see him windmilling his arms as he plummets from the Mystic Tobin Bridge to prove me wrong, to show me he was good, to atone for sins like seeds in the lopsided apple of his heart, but mostly to escape from me in the back of his cab, a Puerto Rican lawyer in a suit and tie. I hated the 111 bus, sweltering in my suit and tie with the crowd in the aisle, waiting to hit a bump on the Mystic Tobin Bridge so my head would finally burst through the ceiling like a giraffe on a circus train. I hated the 111 bus after eviction day in Chelsea District Court, translating the landlords and judges into Spanish so the tenants knew they had to stuff their clothing into garbage bags and steal away again, away from the 40-watt squint that followed them everywhere, that followed me because I stood beside them in court. I would daydream in the humidity of the bus, a basketball hero flipping the balled up pages of the law into the wastebasket at the office as the legal aid lawyers chanted my name. I hated the 111 bus. I had to take a taxi cab that day. "What the hell are you doing here?" said the driver of the cab to me in my suit and tie. "You got to be careful in this neighborhood. There's a lot of Jose's around here." The driver's great-grandfather staggered off a boat so his great-grandson could one day drive me across the Mystic Tobin Bridge, but there was no room in the taxi for chalk and a blackboard. He could hear the sawing of my breath as I leaned into his ear, past the bulletproof barricade somehow missing, and said, "I'm a Jose." I could see the 40-watt squint in his rearview mirror. "I'm Puerto Rican," I said. It was exactly 5 p.m. and we were stuck in traffic in a taxi on the Mystic Tobin Bridge. The driver stammered his own West Side story without the ballet, how a Puerto Rican gang stole his cousin's wallet years ago. "You think I'm going to rob you?" I said, in my suit and tie, close enough now to tickle his ear with the mouth of a revolver. I could hear the sawing of his breath. He still wanted to know what I was doing there. "I'm a lawyer. I go to court with all the Jose's," I said. Stalled traffic steamed around us, the breath of cattle in the winter air. Where are you going for the holidays?" the driver said. I thought about Christmas Eve and court eviction orders flying from the judge's bench when tenants without legal aid lawyers or children old enough to translate the English of the summons did not answer to their names. Every year, the legal aid lawyers told the joke about the Christmas defense. "Your Honor, it's Christmas." I said to the driver, "I will be spending Christmas right here with my fellow Jose's." The driver shouted, "What do you want me to do? Get out of this cab and jump off the bridge?" We both knew what he meant. We both knew about Chuck Stewart, the last man to jump off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. Everybody knew how Chuck drove his wife to Mission Hill after birthing classes, the flash and pop in the dark, and he shot her in the head and himself in the belly. Everybody knew how he conjured a black carjacker on the crackling call to 911, the way the Mercury Theater on the air conjured Martians in New Jersey on the radio half a century before. Everybody knew how 100 cops pounded on door after door in the projects of Mission Hill, locking a black man in a cage for the world to see, like the last of his tribe on exhibit at the World's Fair. Everybody knew how Chuck would have escaped cashing the insurance check to drive away with a new Nissan, but for his brother's confession, the accomplice throwing the Gucci bag with makeup, the wedding rings, and the gun off the Dizzy Bridge in Revere. Everybody knew how Chuck parked his new car on the lower deck, left a note, and launched himself deep into the black water, how the cops hauled his body from the river by lunchtime when I walked into the office to tell the secretary, Chuck Stewart just jumped off the Mystic Tobin Bridge. I said nothing to the driver. I almost nodded yes in the rearview mirror. I confess, for a flash, I wanted him to jump. The driver, the cops, the landlords, the judges, all wanted us to jump off the Mystic Tobin Bridge, all wanted us sprout gills like movie monsters so we could paddle underwater back to the islands, down into the weeds and mud at the bottom, past the fish-plucked rib cages of the dead, the rusty revolvers of 1,000 crimes unsolved, the wedding rings of marriages gone bad, till we washed up on shore in a tangle of seaweed, gasping for air. Last night, still more landed here, clothing stuffed in garbage bags to flee the god of hurricanes flinging their houses into the sky, or the god of hunger slipping his knife between the ribs. Not a dark tide like the tide of the Mystic River, but builders of bridges. You can walk across the bridges they build, or you can jump. This is the title poem of the book. As you've heard in the introduction, two Salvadoran migrants, father and daughter, who came to be known as Oscar and Valeria, drowned crossing the Rio Grande in June of 2019. That photograph of their bodies indeed went viral, sparking outrage, sparking grief, but also sparking trutherism. A post in the I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group charged that the photo was faked. So this poem speaks to the photograph and to these charges. And as you heard in the introduction, Floaters takes its title from the term used by certain members of the Border Patrol to describe those who drown crossing over. Floaters. Epigraph. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask, have y'all ever seen floaters this clean? I'm not trying to be an ass, but I have never seen floaters like this. Could this be another edited photo? We've all seen the Dems and liberal parties do some pretty sick things. Anonymous post. I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group. Like a beer bottle thrown into the river by a boy too drunk to cry. Like a shard of a styrofoam cup drained of coffee brown as the river. Like the plank of a fishing boat broken in half by the river, the dead float. And the dead have a name, Floaters, say the men of the Border Patrol, keeping watch all night by the river, hearts pumping coffee as they say the word floaters, soft as a bubble, hard as a shoe as it nudges the body to see if it breathes, to see if it moans, to see if it sits up and speaks. And the dead have names. A feast day parade of names, names that dress all in red, names that twirl skirts, names that blow whistles, names that shake rattles, names that sing in praise of the saints. Say Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. See how they rise up the tongue. The calling of bird to bird somewhere in the trees above our heads, trilling in the dark heart of the leaves. Say what we know of them now they are dead. Oscar slapped dough for pizza with oven-blistered fingers. Daughter Valeria sang, banging a toy guitar. He slipped free of the apron he wore in the blast of the oven, sold the motorcycle he would kick till it sputtered to life, counted off pesos for the journey across the river, and the last of his 25 years, and the last of her 23 months. There is another name that beats its wings in the heart of the trees. Say, Tanya Vanessa Avalos, Oscar's wife and Valeria's mother, the witness stumbling along the river. Now, their names rise off her tongue. Say, Oscar y Valeria. He swam from Matamoros across to Brownsville. The girl slung around his neck, stood her in the weeds on the Texas side of the river, swore to return with her mother in hand, turning his back as fathers do, who later say, I turned around and she was gone. In the time it takes for a bird to hop from branch to branch, Valeria jumped in the river after her father. Maybe he called out her name as he swept her up from the river. Maybe the river drowned out his voice as the water swept them away. Tanya called out the names of the saints, but the saints drowsed in the stupor of birds in the dark, their cages covered with blankets. The men on patrol would never hear their pleas for asylum, watching for floaters, hearts pumping coffee all night on the Texas side of the river. No one, they say, had ever seen floaters this clean. Oscar's black shirt yanked up to the armpits, Valeria's arm slung around her father's neck, even after the light left her eyes, both face down in the weeds back on the Mexican side of the river. Another edited photo. See how her head disappears in his shirt, the waterlogged diaper bunched in her pants, the blue of the blue cans. The radio warned us about the crisis actors we see at one school shooting after another. A man called Oscar will breathe, sit up, speak, tug the black shirt over his head, shower off the mud, and shake hands with the photographer. Yet, the floaters did not float on the Rio Grande like Olympians showing off the backstroke, nor did their souls float up to Dallas, land of rumored jobs and a president shot in the head as he waved from his motorcade. No bubbles rose from their breath in the mud, light as the iridescent circles of soap that would fascinate a 2-year-old. And the dead still have names. Names that sing in praise of the saints, names the flower and blossoms of white, a cortege of names dressed all in black, trailing the coffins to the cemetery. Carved their names in headlines and gravestones they would never know in the kitchens of this cacophonous world. Enter their names in the book of names. Say Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. Bury them in a corner of the cemetery named for the sainted Archbishop of the Poor, shot in the heart saying Mass, bullets bought by the taxes I paid when I worked as a bouncer and fractured my hand 40 years ago, and bumper stickers read, El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. When the last bubble of breath escapes the body, May the men who speak of floaters, who have never seen floaters this clean, float through the clouds to the heavens, where they paddle the air as they wait for the saint who flips through the keys on his ring like a drowsy janitor, till he fingers the key that turns the lock and shuts the gate on their babble-tongued faces, and they plunge back to earth, a shower of hailstones pelting the river, the Mexican side of the river. Well, times of hate call for poems of love. My wife, Lauren, is a poet, novelist, and a dedicated high school teacher. She taught for many years in urban education, including Springfield, Massachusetts. She would leave in the dark and come home in the dark. And aubade is a French verse form about the parting of lovers at dawn. And indeed we did. So this is called aubade with concussion. Epigraph, poverty is black ice. Naomi Ajala. You leave me sleeping in the dark. You kiss me and I stir, fingers in your hair, eyes open, unseeing. You leave me asleep every morning, commuting to the school in the city at sunrise. The landlord's driveway, a muddy creek, ices over hard after the freezing rain clatters all night. Your feet fly up, your head slamming the ground, an eclipse of the sun flooding your eyes. You sleep under the car. No one knows how long you sleep. You awake with 100 ice picks stabbing your eardrums. You awake, coat and hair soaked, and somehow drive to school. You remember to turn left at the Smith & Wesson factory. The other teachers lead you by the elbow to Mercy Hospital, where you pause when the nurse asks your name, where you claim your pain level is a 4, and they slide you into the white coffin of an MRI machine. You hold your breath. They film your brain. Concussion. The word we use for the boxer plunging face first to the canvas after the uppercut blindsided him, not the teacher commuting to school at sunrise in a Subaru Crosstrek. Yet you would drive, ears hammering as they hammer in the purgatory of the MRI. A week before, Isabella came to you in the classroom and said, "Miss, I cannot sleep. 3 days. I cannot sleep." Her boyfriend called at 2 a.m. and she did not pick up. At 3 a.m., a single shot to the head put him to sleep, and he will sleep forever, his body hidden beneath a car in a parking lot on Maple Street. The cops, the television cameras, the neighbors all gathering at the yellow tape carnival of his corpse. You said to Isabella, "Take this journal, write it down. You don't have to show me. You don't have to show anyone." On the cover of the journal you bought at the drugstore was the word dream. Isabella sat there in your classroom at your desk, pencil waving in furious circles. By lunchtime, as her friends slapped each other, Isabella slept, head on the desk, face pressed against the pages of the journal. This is why I watch you sleep at 3 a.m. when the sleeping pills fail to quell the strike beating in my brain. This is why I say to you when you kiss me in my sleep, "Don't go, don't go." You have to go. So that is for Lauren Marie Schmidt. And this is for Jack Agüeros. These days we need the visionaries, and especially we need the elders in our community. Jack Agüeros was a Puerto Rican poet, fiction writer, playwright, essayist, translator, community organizer, and the director of El Museo del Barrio in East Harlem. He was also my second father. Jack died from complications of Alzheimer's in 2014. This poem is for him. It's called Flan, by Jack Agüeros, 1934, 2014. I was 8 when the blackout struck and the lights died all across the city like a massacre of fireflies. In the projects of Brooklyn, I steered myself to 14F, fingers spread against the cool tiles of the hallway, past the concrete and chicken wire terrace where I once burnt ants with a magnifying glass. Many years later, at the Chinese restaurant uptown, Jack said, "They got any flan here?" He was my first poet. I had seen the fireflies in his sonnets blink and float away. Fulano, the philosopher in the unemployment line. Blanco, the painter painting in the madhouse. Monterosa, the dealer killed by shotgun in a bar on Avenue A. His mother, the seamstress in the quick needle of her sewing machine. Jack, the moving man, his hands sliced raw. He stacked his apartment with dictionaries in 3 languages. I knew the raconteur's grin with every tale. Raul Julia is a friend of mine, a Puerto Rican playing Macbeth. He took 14 curtain calls on opening night. Maybe he would tell me now that flan was not Puerto Rican or Mexican or Spanish, but Chinese, invented by a trembling cook to satisfy the palate of an emperor in the Ming dynasty. "No flan, Jack," I said. "This is a Chinese restaurant." 2 minutes later, he said, "They got any flan?" I showed him the dog-eared and fingerprinted menu. "No flan," I said. When the waiter unfurled his pad, Jack said to him, "You got flan?" He sang this song for an hour. The egg roll was not flan. The fried rice was not flan. The fortune cookie was not flan. "Can we get some flan?" he said. "God damn it, Jack," I said. The poets crowded into the bar, striding to the mic. Jack stood with poem in hand, read the title, tilted his head, and said it again. Studied the page as if the words shriveled up like ants burnt under a magnifying glass, then sat down. I witnessed the massacre of fireflies. A few of us clapped, not knowing what to do with our hands, staring at the sonneteer who lost all his quatrains and couplets in the denim jacket he left on the subway, the words of Fulano still waiting on the unemployment line. The faster you spin, the stiller you look. There's something to learn in that. But what? After the diagnosis, I handed Jack a book of poems. He dangled the book upside down, like a stiff mouse by the tail, something we would sniff behind the refrigerator. I wanted sonnets. Jack kept singing the chorus of a song. "Get me to the church, get me to the church, get me to the church on time." At the end, I leaned over Jack's bed to read his own poem in his ear, but some words come home after the blackout fingers crawling on the wall. I know what I should have said at the Chinese restaurant. "Jack, let's get some flan." We should have braved the subway at rush hour, strap hangers rocking all the way to 14th Street and 8th Avenue, to La Taza de Oro, gone now like Jack for rice and beans, squid in its own ink, café con leche y flan, Jack. A spoonful of flan for you after all the years of sonnets and bread for me, the steam rising when your hands crack the crust at the table. Jack and my father, Martín Espada, were very close. They were activists together in the 1960s. I want to read this poem for my father. It's called Death Rides the Elevator in Brooklyn. On a winter morning in 1968, my father left to walk the picket line. He rode the elevator in his black coat, hood over his head in the hour before daybreak. On the third floor, the doors opened. A white man waiting for the elevator stood there, peered at my father in his black coat and hood, in his brown skin, then screamed and fled. The door closed. My father laughed on the picket line that morning. He laughed for years. The guy thought I was death, he would say. Death rides an elevator in Brooklyn. Mugger death, militant death, Puerto Rican death. Listening to the story, as the screaming man screamed louder with every telling, I never thought one day my father would be the man standing there waiting for the elevator doors to open. He did not stare or scream or run. He stepped into the elevator and the doors closed behind him. My father, Francisco Luis Espada, was born in the mountain town of Utuado, Puerto Rico in 1930. And he died in Pacifica, California in 2014. His mother was born in Utuado. His grandfather was the mayor of Utuado. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in the fall of 2017, I saw Utuado over and over again on TV, on the internet, in the headlines. As John Lee Anderson put it in the New Yorker, Utuado had, quote, become a byword for the island's devastation. At least 3,000 died in Puerto Rico, according to one study. Some placed the death toll at more than 4,000. And so I started talking to my father while this was going on. My father, who died 3 years before, actually I started talking to his ashes in a box on my bookshelf. And that was the genesis of the last poem I will read this afternoon. This poem is called Letter to My Father, October 2017. You once said, my reward for this life will be 1,000 pounds of dirt shoveled in my face. You were wrong. You are 7 pounds of ashes in a box, a Puerto Rican flag wrapped around you next to a red brick from the house in Utuado where you were born, all crammed together on my bookshelf. You taught me there is no God, no life after this life, so I know you are not watching me type this letter over my shoulder. When I was a boy, you were God. I watched from the 7th floor of the projects as you walked down into the street to stop a public execution. A big man caught a small man stealing his car, and everyone in Brooklyn heard the car alarm wail of the condemned. He's killing me! At a word from you, the executioner's hand slipped from the hair of the thief. The kid was high, was all you said when you came back to us. When I was a boy, and you were God, we flew to Puerto Rico. You said, my grandfather was the mayor of Utuado. His name was Buenaventura. That means good fortune. I believed in your grandfather's name. I heard the tree frogs chanting to each other all night. I saw a banana leaf and elephant palm sprouting from the mountain's belly. I gnawed the mango's pit, and the sweet yellow hair stuck between my teeth. I said to you, you came from another planet. How'd you do it? You said, every morning, just before I woke up, I saw the mountains. Every morning, I see the mountains. And Utuado, three sisters, all in their 70s, all bedridden, all Pentecostales who only left the house for church, lay sleeping on mattresses spread across the floor when the hurricane gutted the mountain the way a butcher slices open a dangled pig, and a rolling wall of mud buried them, leaving the fourth sister to stagger into the street, screaming like an unheeded prophet about the end of the world. And Utuado, a man who cultivated a garden of aguacate and carambola, feeding the avocado and star fruit to his nieces from New York, so the trees in his garden be headed all at once like the soldiers of a beaten army, and so hanged himself. And Utuado, a welder and a handyman, rigged a pulley with a shopping cart to ferry rice and beans across the river where the bridge collapsed, witnessed the cart swaying above so many hands, that raised a sign that told the helicopters, Campamento Los Olvidados, Camp of the Forgotten. Los Olvidados wait 7 hours in line for a government meal of Skittles and Vienna sausage, or a tarp to cover the bones of a house with no roof as the fungus grows on their skin from sleeping on mattresses drenched with the spit of the hurricane. They drink the brown water, waiting for microscopic monsters in their bellies to visit plagues upon them. A nurse says, these people are going to have an epidemic. These people are going to die. The president flips rolls of paper towels to a crowd at a church in Guaynabo, Zeus lobbing thunderbolts on the locked ward of his delusions. Down the block, cousin Ricardo, Bernice's boy, says that somebody stole his can of diesel. I heard somebody ask you once what Puerto Rico needed to be free, and you said, 3 pulgadas de sangre en la calle. 3 inches of blood in the street. Now, 3 inches of mud flow through the streets of Utuado, and troops patrol the town as if guarding the vein of copper in the ground, as if a shovel digging graves in the backyard might strike the ore below, as if La Brigada swinging machetes to clear the road might remember the last uprising. I know you are not God. I have the proof. 7 pounds of ashes in a box on my bookshelf. Gods do not die, and yet I want you to be God again. Stride from the crowd to seize the president's arm before another roll of paper towels sails away. Thunder Spanish obscenities in his face. Banish him to a roofless rainstorm in Utuado, so he unravels one soaked sheet after another till there is nothing left but his cardboard heart. I promised myself I would stop talking to you. White box of gray grit. You were deaf even before you died. Hear my promise now. I will take you to the mountains where houses lost like ships at sea rise blue and yellow from the mud. I will open my hands. I will scatter your ashes. En Utuado. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.